The following is a conversation between myself and Mr. Alfred Cromwell, founder and president of City Tutoring. A Columbia University graduate, Mr. Cromwell has a passion, with a capital P, for pure mathematics. He spent decades sharing his knowledge across European cities, American colleges, and most recently, the internet. In carving his own path, Mr. Cromwell has cultivated a skill set and a personality that's entirely his own. While he was one of the earliest adopters of the virtual classroom model, he instead evokes the spirit of a golden age mathematician in both diction and dress. Speaking from his classically furnished home in Lynchburg, Virginia, he explains that he turns his smartphone off when he's not working and still prefers to use his Commodore 64 over a modern computer. It may be that the internet has grown more attached to Mr. Cromwell than vice versa. His YouTube channel, now approaching 40,000 subscribers, features hours of lectures spanning topics such as mathematics, Sunday sermons, advice for young people, and critiques of social issues. Our conversation, however, centers on educational philosophies and the trends of modern learning, particularly how the internet has opened new opportunities and challenges for educators and students alike. I greatly enjoyed my conversation with Mr. Cromwell, and I found that his nuanced responses provided a refreshing insight into the future of this virtual landscape. I also feel the need to point out that our matching outfits were not intentional, but it once again goes to show that great minds think alike. Without further ado, this is Mr. Alfred Cromwell. Thank you very much for being here today. We've got a lot to get to, but I think it's going to be awesome. So, would you like to start off by mainly providing a little bit of your background and what it is that you currently find yourself doing?
I did an undergraduate degree in Columbia University, a bachelor's degree in pure mathematics, although they didn't call it that at the time because they had the School of Engineering, but I was not in the School of Engineering. I was in Columbia College. And so I graduated, did my undergrad there. I minored in political science, international relations, because I thought it was a good complement. I wanted to use math in some kind of public capacity. Then after finishing my undergrad, I went to the University of London, specifically Imperial College, where I got my master's degree. And there they did have specifically pure mathematics. And I did not pursue a PhD because I was of the opinion, and I'm still of the criteria, that it's not necessary for being a pure mathematician. And so I was kind of following a tradition in that. And then after that, I just decided, I stayed in England for a while. I started an academy there that was a sort of like for I guess the closest equivalent in the US would be like high school level. And it was basically training students, tutoring students for both GCSEs, the General Certificate of Secondary Education, and the A levels that they have over there, which was all based on the mathematics. Then I lived in France for a while, and I did the same thing, except in France. But in France, it was actually more interesting because the French people wanted me to, they said, we have a lot of mathematicians in France, but what we don't have is a lot of good English speakers. And so my academy focused more on language. That was a huge shift for me. But there was a lot of business. It was very lucrative during those days because in France, you had to, in order to get any of the good jobs in France, you had to actually speak a very high level. You had to have a C2 level of English, which was in the Cambridge they have something called the Cambridge examination. So then I did the same thing in Spain. So I lived in Spain for a while and then returned to the US, taught in different colleges as an adjunct for a while. And now I'm running City Tutoring here in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Wow, that's a very broad background with a lot of experience. So was it sort of immediately after you graduated that you moved to England?
Yes. So right when I graduated, most of my classmates at the time, they had a very, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, much to the contrary, they had a very rigid idea of what it meant to finish their degree. They would say, okay, I finished my degree, now I'm going to do my MBA or do my master's, but it was all very formulaic because they wanted to end up in some kind of financial, most of the math majors, at least at Columbia, can't speak for everywhere, but they wanted to end up in as quants or as financial analysts down in Wall Street. They wanted to work in finance, and that was tempting for a while. But I always had a very independent or individualistic streak, so I knew that that wasn't going to be very much not something for me. So then I decided to just pursue the master's. I always wanted, I was curious about England for many reasons, for historical reasons. And so I decided it was going to be an easy transition going into that system.
So that's actually another part of why I wanted to interview you. It seems that you've gotten off the beaten path in doing your own individualistically motivated career, really. But so you moved to England, and then just to get the full picture of the background here, what made you want to switch over to France?
So I was noticing even though there are differences, of course, being England being a different country, you still see sort of, I've always said that the English people are it's sort of like you definitely see that they are a relative, whether it be distant or not. You definitely see a strong connection with the U.S. But I wanted something. So even though they might have different, there's obviously cultural differences, but at the end of the day, there's a continuity that extends. You could say this about England, Australia, the Anglosphere, as the French very accurately say. But I wanted something different. I took French in high school, and I also took French in college. But I did not have, even though I can read French and I could very much write a lot of French, I could not, for the life of me, because I could not practice my verbal expression, I could not really speak French, especially not in the French way. So I wanted to have that kind of as my goal. So language was one reason, but also France was very known for having a lot of great mathematicians like Galois, Blaise Pascal, and all the other ones. And I knew that Paris had the Sorbonne. I knew that a lot of their street names, actually, unlike many other places, they're actually named after mathematicians. So that already had a great attraction to me. And the other element was they have excellent math, or they used to, not anymore, because if you ask the French people now, they would tell you that that's not the case now. But even up to my day, they had very good mathematics education to the point where some of their textbooks are just absolutely excellent in comparison to what you would get even in the UK or the US at the time.
Gotcha. So it was in pursuit of language and once again stemming from your love for mathematics. So then moving forward here, uh, you're in France for a while. What uh, was the impetus for the switch to Spain then?
Similar. So after a while, everything became. France has a very strict bureaucracy about how things are done, and so does Spain, but in a different way because what I found in Spain, and I'll get to that in a moment, but in more detail. But what I found in Spain was because they have a lot of different regions that are very different from each other. It was actually reminded me in that sense, in a positive way, of the United States. Because if you went to, say, Madrid, they had a very different educational system, or even like the way they spoke, compared to, say, Valencia or Barcelona. Everything was very decentralized. So in my mind, I said, well, if they are such a decentralized country in many ways, although they're more centralist in other ways compared to the US, I said I was going to have more flexibility to do the kind of business that I wanted. Because in France, in order for you to maintain your continue with what you were doing, my academy, for example, eventually I got the government inspectors came and they said, you know what? We love what you do. But guess what? Your degree, even though your degree is from Columbia University, is not recognized by the French Ministry of Education. And so I thought in the beginning, I said, but I'm having all these results. I'm getting all the students are happy, but they're like, nope, it's not going to happen. They said your option is you can become a non-accredited school, but then you would just be like what they used to call, I think back in those days was called like the translation would be like vocations, where it would be just like liberal arts, but it wouldn't have any credits because since you are not, even though you have a degree in mathematics, you are not recognized by the French government. And therefore you cannot award degrees. Your institution cannot award any kind of that. I get part of that. But then when it came to actually having to recognize my degree, it was not easy at all. So I thought it was going to be a lot harder. The work involved in it and the investment in it would be a lot harder than actually just switching over to something else.
Gotcha. So you were kind of, at least if you didn't want to put the investment in there, you were kind of forced over to a new system. So then you're in Spain for a while, and then eventually you make it back to the U.S. What was the deal there? Just to plot this path on the map here.
So I had a very good life in Spain. I made this. So Spain is a country that has traditionally had very high unemployment, extremely high, extremely low wages. Although it can be said that their lifestyle there, I'm of course generalizing, can't speak for everyone, but in general, even with the low salaries, the cost of living was relatively more proportional back in those days to the South. I don't know now because I have not been there in many years, but. The kind of job that I was doing, I was making way above average. So it's kind of like, nowadays, if an American goes to say like Cancun with dollars, right, and the currency exchange or whatever, it actually ends up being you actually have twice as much in many cases, right? So that was my case in Spain. The problem is that after a while, I increasingly noticed, and this is not a critique of Spain, this is just a system. The European Union was increasingly becoming aggressive, and a lot of people were losing a lot of the freedoms that were taken for granted before. So I started noticing an encroachment against education, against freedom of speech in many ways, against even the written word. And these were not just national rules, because I'm always of the opinion that a person who is a foreigner should always respect the host country in every way, never meddle in their own. That's something that should always be respected, the sovereignty of every nation. But this went above and beyond because now the European Union was threatening everybody's sovereignty. And so I increasingly became very concerned with what I was seeing. Towards the end of my years there, I was actually hired, believe it or not, even though my degree was not, because they had a similar system where your degree had to be recognized by the ministry, but they're a little bit more flexible given their decentralized system. So they hired me in one of the well-known colleges there. It's spelled ICADE. It's a private Catholic university, but it's one of the best in Madrid. And it's funny because, me being a Protestant, there's inevitably the joke started, right? The Anglican, is now here, the Protestant, and I had a lot of fun, but they, especially being at a Roman Catholic, you see crucifix everywhere, right? And so, in that sense, statues everywhere, the mass, which is completely different from my own Christian tradition, but. I lasted there a year because I was hired as a substitute because the actual professor they have something called maternity leave over there. They have the right to stay out like for several months. So I was actually covering for her math classes, but then they did not rehire me because she actually decided to come back. And I knew that was part of the deal. But then I noticed increasingly, so it was a mix of an assault on several freedoms. And then also, it's a very stagnant economy. So the problem is that it's not easy you can start a business, but it's much harder than in the United States. And at the end of the day, there's always like a ceiling that you will reach. So because the European philosophy tends to be, and I say European because it's very common to many countries in Europe, they're very community oriented. So if you are making too much, that's actually not going to happen as easily as in the US. It's a whole different philosophy as to how far you can go in life. And in the philosophy there is as long as you're making a reasonable salary, then everything else is okay. The word ambition, for example, is actually considered negative. If you tell somebody over there that you're an ambitious person, they see that as something very negative, and it's not considered socially acceptable for the most part. So after I had noticed that, that I was trapped in, I said, well, I could continue doing what I'm doing because I was doing well relatively, but I think I could do better. And the US being a little bit more, although that's changing, unfortunately, but it used to be much more flexible for business. Um, and so, and then I also, there was a more selfish reason, but natural at the same time, was, my family was all in the US. And as your family ages, you want to, at least I wanted to be closer, aging in place, as they say. So that it was a mixture of those things.
Then when you got to the back to the States, did you immediately go back to adjunct professing, or did you then seek out to what might be more easy back home, create your own tutoring business once again?
I'm glad you noticed that, because yes, when I returned, I went direct, since I still wanted to be in a semi-walkable, or at least walkable city, right? I had a few options in the US, and I said, well, let me go back to New York City because it's walkable. And I was so used to, if you lived in Europe, everything is walkable. And I had not driven a car in decades, pretty much. So I went to New York City, found a lovely brownstone there. It wasn't easy because New York City's rental market is tough, but I was able to meet what they call, the dream was to meet a small landlord, right? Small, and it ended up working very well. At that time, I was unemployed because I was starting in my mind, I was going to start the tutoring business. But then one day I'm sitting in my living room, and I got an email because they had many places had my resume, and I got an email, and it said, "Do you want to teach?" It was from a local college, and they said, "Do you want to teach?" And I said, "Sure, why not?" And I mean, I wasn't doing a lot anyway. And I ended up teaching one class first. They said, you're going to meet Mondays and Wednesdays. This was a part of the Hunter College system. And so I was adjuncting. And so I taught one course, and students started really liking the stuff because and I don't say that out of vanity or, arrogance. I was surprised myself because I tend to take a very rigid approach to mathematics. So all of a sudden, the deans are calling me and they're saying, the students are raving about you. And I said, really? They say, yeah, they say they love that you actually go to the board, you do problems, you have a passion in what you do. I said, oh, okay. So I said, we're offering you yet another course. Would you be interested in another course? I said, yeah, why not? And that sort of became, I became full-time for a while. Although still hired as an adjunct because I didn't want to commit, given my vision for my own tutoring academy. And then this was a little bit before COVID, and then COVID strikes, right? 2020. And so there, they said we were teaching online for a while. And I had already taught online in some ways, being international in many ways. I had already, way before this whole virtual thing started, I already had online classes. I thought it was a logical thing to do, believe it or not. Even though I'm off grid in some ways, I thought that it was very convenient to do. So way before this whole COVID thing started. But anyway, they said after COVID, they said, you got to work back in person. So I decided, you know what? I was done with New York City at that point. It was just too stressful. The city changed, and not for the better in many ways. So I ended up just deciding, I said, you know what? I need a midpoint. Ended up here in Virginia, beautiful Lynchburg. First Charlottesville, although Charlottesville was all right, but I'd much rather be in Lynchburg, in the rolling hills. I don't know, are you familiar with the area, but it's rolling hills.
I have a close friend who visits there semi frequently, and oh man, the what he's told me about the rolling hills of Virginia, I really have to get out there. It sounds so beautiful.
Changed my perspective, coming from a city, and I've always lived in cities for the most part. I mean, I went to undergrad in New York, lived in London, then Paris, then Madrid, and I said, and I thought people laughed. They say, you are not going to last you are not going to last in Lynchburg because they said it's not walkable, it's country in many places. I said, but that's actually what I want now at this stage of my life. And so I ended up here, bought land, and I have a very old. I'm very happy with my home. It's a very old school style. I don't know if you could tell. It's quite old, and that's so. Here I am, and now I am dedicated to city tutoring at this point.
So where are you originally from then? Are you originally from an urban area?
Not necessarily urban, but suburban. So I grew up in Bergen County, New Jersey. Although a lot of people think when they meet me, they always think New England for some reason. Everybody says you look more like from New England or New Hampshire because I don't, because of my speaking, I don't really speak like a New Jersey. I don't say like the thick New Jersey accent. But I've always, so I lived in but if you know Bergen County, it's relatively close to New York. It's just a suburb, really. It's not nowhere, nothing like this.
Gotcha. Okay, so you mentioned, really getting into the meat here, then you mentioned that you, even before COVID, when it sort of became, well, it had to become the status quo, you operated online classes. Around what time did that start, would you say? Around what year, maybe?
It started in Spain. I would say around 2013, 2012.
Wow. So you were really that was ahead of the curve for sure. That was before most what did you use? Skype?
We would use Skype, and then after Skype, there was there were some online tutoring companies that had their own platform that they would hire me through. So they had it was a video chat pretty much, but back in those days, definitely Skype. And then sometimes, even before then, although I was never a part of that, there was something called the correspondence courses where you would actually mail your assignments and whatever. But I'm not that old, but that was kind of the precursor to that.
The telelessons of sorts, yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 2013, what got you into, well, that's sort of a future oriented operation, not the status quo, maybe a little bit novel for students at that time, especially. So what made you see the opportunity and want to branch out to something that was just emerging like that?
Because it was more of a reaction that I had to the trends that I saw and still see, unfortunately, in the standardized schools. I figured that if internet is an option and it can be a great tool, then people who actually had a different and I say this positively, ambition. I've been traumatized by the word, but if you had the vision, the ambition to do different, then what better way to do it than to create your own movement online, right? Where you can actually get like-minded people and create a community of sorts who share, at least in many ways, maybe not 100%, but who share your vision. And many times, I've realized this many times, and this is coming from me that I'm very old school in my ideas. But I think that if you look at what was happening even back then, a lot of professors were just posting their notes already online. And my thought was, why should a student pay to commute to a college where the professor himself or herself is not doing the job that they should? Because I think a professor should do more than upload PowerPoint slides. If you can get that online, I can get that anywhere. I mean, you could mail it to me if you want. That's not really fostering the kind of environment that I would have liked to see in a college. So I figured that if that's what a class is, you just go in the class and just copy what's on the PowerPoint. Why not do it online? So I had that vision way before COVID. So when COVID struck and people said, "Oh, this is going to be a disaster because we're going to have online classes," actually, my attendance had never been better and has never been better than when we are virtual. because in class, people would make up all sorts, oh, I have an appointment, or, oh, there was in New York, they would say there was a train delay. And, there was no recording. Nowadays, you can record the classes so you can watch them on your own time. I mean, I just see advantages all throughout.
Absolutely. It's a more convenient way. And I'm sure that when you really started this, or when you had to switch over due to COVID, you sort of hit the ground running due to your prior experience. You didn't have to learn Zoom.
People are surprised when when they say, because when they see my lifestyle and they see that I'm relatively low tech, they're surprised. I had one gentleman one time left a comment, said, because I have a very old computer, not the one I'm using now, but Commodore 64. I use it for other reasons. And the guy said, how is it that a guy who has a Commodore 64, is uploading YouTube? I mean, one thing doesn't exclude the other. So
Yes, sir, exactly. And also, I've noticed this. Is your, not the web browser shame here, but you use Edge, correct? Gotcha.
And now transitioning to a gentleman, an amazing guy, he emailed me and he gifted me. I felt so, on the spot, but I couldn't believe his generosity. He gifted me with a Raspberry Pi 5, and he actually installed Linux on there. So now he's sent me like all this information, because now I'm transitioning into Linux.
Oh, that's incredible. Man, those are really amazing, budgetary friendly ways to really experiment and learn and explore all of the potentials of computers. Really, they can be great for people of all ages, really, from as young as you have to be to operate a computer to, I've even met 70-year-olds who are exploring that kind of space. So, but that is really cool. I wish you well with your Raspberry Pi adventures. There's a lot that you can do.
Thank you.
But, okay, so you originally started operating your sort of online lessons while you were in Madrid, you said?
I was in Madrid, but then I because purely for climate reasons, I said, they have a very dry climate. Well, you're probably familiar in Texas, it's semi-arid. And it's just not, people always complain about the humidity, but it was just not, those summers there, you get like 105, 110. Although you do get beautiful, blue skies. But then I said, you know what, I need a little bit of a coast. So I actually ended up, went from Madrid to first spend like a week in Barcelona, but then actually moved, my last year in Spain, my last 2 years were in Valencia, the beautiful city. But it's a coastal city. So that was a lot of fun. And that's when I really got into the online stuff.
Were those students that were based in Valencia or in Spain, or was it one of the powers of the internet, just like you were speaking earlier, is community formation is not geographically limited. So what was the scope of your online operations then?
Back in those days, the Spaniards were not very keen, because they were actually very traditional about many things. So they were not very keen on this whole online format. So most of my students were people who knew me, because I used to run a blog back in those days. It was more of a political blog. And they knew me from England and the US. So most of my students, they wanted to take some math courses through. So they would email me, they'd be in the UK. They say, you know what, I know you're in Spain right now, but I'd love to take your course. And then people, it was basically like private clients. So, by request at that point.
Okay. Did you find that it was easier to communicate with people over the internet due to the sort of barriers, like you were mentioning earlier, the barriers to attendance and engagement? Did you find that it was easier to communicate and educate people through the internet, or did the computer screen sort of place a barrier there?
I really believe that in my case, and it will vary by individual, if you are good at mastering this, it is absolutely the best. Because as I've always used to say, there's no such thing as a back seat or a back row online. I can literally click on the tile with your name and say, what are you doing? And I do often. I do call on people often, but it takes a special kind of personality to do that, because I have colleagues who have worked online and their results, I mean, you're in college, so you know the student evaluations. So when they got their student evaluations back, they were terrible. Students would say, this professor, yeah, and it happens, right? Because knowledge of a subject does not necessarily mean great teaching. They're two different things. I know mathematicians who, first of all, who they tell me, I would never want to teach a class. It's not their thing. I'm different in that, because what I enjoy the most about math is not just doing the math, but it's also sharing it to a wide range, to an audience of people into it. So I found that the online was very easy for me, because I was able to take advantage of my individualistic streak and say, because you can't really do that in a class, because even though it's your class, you're still within a building, you're still within some kind of institution, you're still being watched in some ways, right? Whereas here, I can literally do my thing, and it's voluntary, because people come because they want. And even when people were, even in the required courses, when I was teaching online during COVID for the actual colleges, my attendance was great, because they knew I wasn't just going to upload PowerPoints. They could do that on their own. I knew I was going to hold them accountable, and I knew that they knew that I was doing the reading too. I said, I'm reading too. I'm reading right along with this class. We would read, let's say, analysis, right? Or we read calculus. And every year was something different. So I really was able to take advantage of the online format. And I find it quite easy for me. But you have to have the personality for it. You have to be able to engage people in your class in some way.
Right. Whether it's live or pre-recorded, like such as a YouTube video, you have to have a design-oriented mindset that is in certain ways, you actually have to be more engaging over the computer than you would be in a classroom.
Yes.
Because in a classroom, you have a captive audience versus here, let's say the instructor is unengaging, students can do literally anything else. They can be anywhere on the planet. Yep. They can be engaging with any service, and there's sort of a democratization of the students' buying power there.
But at the same time, because of that, and you're absolutely correct, but because of that, I also have more of a freedom to call people out in a certain way, because what I'd be doing is, let's say we're doing limits, right? And I randomly, because you have to have the attention for it, but I would say something like, if I have a class here of 30 people and I see your name, right? And I saw that let's say your camera was off, and I'd be like, okay, so number 5, X equals such and such. And I said, right, Mr. Powell? And then all of a sudden, right, people knew I was going to hold you accountable. And if you didn't respond, I would actually, it goes on record, I would say, oh, so I guess Mr. Powell is out today. Guess we're going to put an absence today. That sort of energy, that sort of interact, and students appreciate it at the end of the day, because I am a strong advocate for students, believe it or not, even though people don't normally see me that way, because they say, oh, it's so strict, or it's so many rules. But I'm actually on the student side in many things. For example, most students prefer the online. Most students who complain about certain things in the education system, they are absolutely correct. I've had students come to me and they say, you know what, I go to this other class, professor doesn't answer emails. And I get that part. I said, but what about, okay, does your professor have a phone that you can dial? No. How do you communicate then? They say, oh, it's just like during class, 5 minutes. I said, see, that's not serious. And so the student is absolutely correct, especially whether we want to agree with it or not. Students today, particularly in the United States, you are a consumer. I'm not saying it's always good, but the reality is that if someone is paying for something, they expect some kind of something in return for it. So there's that.
Exactly. There's a transactional nature to it, and the product is the education.
Mhm.
Uh, which is, well, truthfully, it's good that you see it that way because you understand that you are value adding. It's not a it's something that when the student leaves the classroom, they have to have the education with them. And it's additionally good that the reason why it's a live lecture is because it's well, the only differentiation between this could be a pre-recorded thing or this could be a live stream is students have to engage or can engage with a live thing. So it's good that you bring sort of instead of just speaking into a mirror, you bring them into it because it's one of the things that typical online education is lacking is the engagement portion. So, uh, is it City Tutoring, is that exclusively online, or did you start in person, or has it been online and uh, this whole time?
Done both, but at this point, all of the classes are online. I have done both though, because there are some parents. So here, this area, for example, has a lot of homeschoolers. And so the homeschoolers, some of them, I've had people say they actually come to me, but they're welcome here because I have actually a dedicated space for a classroom. So so I've had people come to me, usually small groups, but for the most part, it's online. And but I enjoy, sometimes I've had a student who says, I can do the online, but they like the more, in-person sort of. But they do it more not because they feel they learn more, but they do it more because they like the social aspect of it, which is that is different. You can actually, you don't really get. I mean, you could see somebody online, right? But you don't really get that sort of bonding that happens in person.
Why is that, would you say? Is it that, you see someone's face up, but you can't, whisper something to them or what is the discrepancy there?
I think it's the anonymous nature, the free nature of it. Since you're not constrained to, like if you go to somebody's house and no matter how generous the person is, it's still not your house. So if you're a normal person or a semi-normal person, there's always that sense of, I'm not in my home and therefore I can't just, do what I normally do in my own home, right? I can't just, out of pure manners, right? If I go to my neighbor's house, I'm not going to just walk into the kitchen and open the fridge and, take whatever I want. I would first ask. And I think with online, we have the tendency because of the sort of the anonymous, we're not as accountable online. And therefore it can also lead to bad behaviors, as we often see with, social media and the excess of, if you have, you can nowadays anybody could make up a fake name, hide their face, open up a website and say the most horrific things about an individual, whether they're true or untrue.
That's one of the unfortunate operations of the internet is it allows, well, anyone to have a voice, but unfortunately sometimes there's bad faith there. The business, is it do you mainly market to those around you in Lynchburg, or is it open to all, do you have students from all around the US?
Actually, most of my students are from different areas. So they're mostly, I get students from New York, California, Texas recently. So it's actually, I get more from outside because this area is quite small. And so there's not a lot of population here. And when I do get from this area, it's mostly students from Charlottesville area because they go to UVA. UVA is huge. But here, even though here we have Liberty University, we have Randolph College. We have the community college as well, but it's just not, and the University of Lynchburg. But there's not a lot of math students here per se, right? So at the college level, it's mostly, either humanities or business. We do get business, but the business majors here, they not, as you said earlier, you don't really get a lot of them. Not the sort of calc 1, 2, 3 stuff.
Yes, sir. I had to take business calculus, which I always say if you put business before any subject, it becomes basically the easier form of that subject, you know?
I'm glad you said that and not me.
Hey, I can say it. I'm a business major. I'm paying for it, right?
Right.
Okay, so from all around, how did these students from, say California, the opposite end of the country, how did all of these students find out about you?
It's mostly through, when they look up my name, they saw that I've written a book. Well, 2 books really. I'm currently working on a third one. That takes a while. But the one was my biography, which is called, if I may say, Mathematician to Mathematician. And so it's because I started out as believe it or not, in the 7th grade, I was
A
actually failing.
mathematician. Oh.
Yeah, yeah. And I was scared because my teacher, although I thank the Lord that that was the case, I was a mathematician because it was terrifying and I was failing her class. And so I became, the chicken. And she would send me to the board and I didn't know how to, and I knew it was on me, but her approach was take no prisoners. And she would put you in front of the board, humiliate you in front of the whole class. And I realized that from that point, I was never going to be humiliated again. And I knew that I really had to step the game up, as they say. And so that's how most of people find out. And also, a lot of it is word of mouth, and also people who, because I just started the website a few months ago. Before that, it was mostly, so now people through the website, they see, and then YouTube as well, because people see what I do on YouTube and they see that how I teach certain things. I'm starting, there's always so much to do, but, I'm doing a series of playlists like analysis. We're doing analysis, algebra, but it's all random, and so they see different things. And a lot of the videos I post are common errors that I see students make, and that I also see, unfortunately, some teachers who are not mathematicians teach, and so which creates a whole nother discussion.
I understand that completely. So what was the sort of what drove you to begin, posting these lectures, and then later all sorts of videos?
It has to do with the philosophical question of, the philosophical questions of teaching, right? Because that has always been a challenge for me. Because I believe that there are several philosophical foundations for education, if I may put it that way.
Plato would agree.
Yes. I think in the realm of mathematics, it becomes a little trickier. I decided to do the YouTube because of what I was seeing in the education. I was seeing that math was taught as a utilitarian skill rather than what I think it is, which is really a civilizing force. It's a discipline that trains the mind in being clarity, precision, and rigor, intellectual rigor. So I adhere to the classical tradition of instruction. I've mentioned for example, the Dolciani books, and also the great books curriculum, when mathematical rigor was seen, it was not seen as an obstacle, but as a virtue. And so I decided that YouTube was a good way to share that. A lot of people who knew me would tell me, why don't you do YouTube? And that was always alien to me, believe it or not, because I said to myself, they said, but you already do online teaching. You're already a sort of a public speaker. You've been in controversies before. So, why not YouTube? And I said, I thought of YouTuber as, something like, I don't know, just a YouTuber, just alien to, but then I tried it a few times, maybe like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and I uploaded like 2 or 3 videos. And I had a few people watch, and then recently I picked up again back in October, and it's just I couldn't believe it just exploded from there.
So was it for the sake of marketing your business, providing a sort of demo, or was it more like I hate to put it this way, but more with the intention of a side hustle or something like that.
No, that's a good question. I really wanted, it was more, my intention was originally, was more to show people what pure mathematics looks like and why things are done in the way, like, for example, a lot of students say, okay, when you multiply two negative numbers, you get a positive, but nobody, I mean, very few people tell you why that is. And I always tell my students, I'm not satisfied with, oh, that's just the way it is. That's not acceptable to a mathematician. So I really wanted to promote and still promote the idea of purity in thought, the idea of a rigorous, like always ask the question, why? Take your teacher to task. And if they don't know something, I've told teachers the same thing. If you don't know something, you tell your students you don't know. It's okay. But don't make stuff up and say, oh, that's just the way it is. That's not mathematical talk at all. You can see I get a little bit excited when it comes to these things because it's something that truly needs to be said.
It's very good. I find that a strong conviction in a strong educational philosophy makes a teacher. I've never met a great teacher who doesn't have convictions and tenets when it comes to education. What would you say? You've already illuminated some of them, but what would you say are some of your educational foundational philosophies?
It all has to do with rejection of dilution to chase engagement, right? And we see that a lot today. And when I mean by engagement, I mean I don't mean that participation is bad. Much to the contrary, I mean engagement, telling young people, students, what they want to hear rather than what they should hear, because when you are, and this has been through my experience, that's why I'm always saying that I'm actually on the side of the students. When your students see that you are an honest person with your whatever it be your convictions, whatever you teach, you will get the engagement that you need. But what you don't want to do is get engagement for the sake of engagement and say, oh, we're going to make this class, a party, because it's not a party. And it requires work, but it can also be very interesting. It can also be fun. But if you trust that the human mind, when you lead it properly, delights in, most people, I would say, actually delight in discipline of some kind. I'm often quoted as saying that true happiness means being right. It means that you are absolutely correct in something. And some people might disagree with that. Some people might say, no, I'd rather be happy rather than right, because right creates, too many problems. But no, because right gives you that certainty. That's the closest we can get as human beings. It's not that we know everything. We cannot know every single thing, but we can know about a system that we create. And I would much rather, and probably you as a student as well, you would much rather go to a class where the professor, where you know what to expect, you know what the expectations are, you know what is going to be covered, rather than somebody might be smiling at you every day, but you never know what to expect from them. You have no standards at all. And then all of a sudden at the end of the semester, when it comes, the reckoning comes, and then you don't feel prepared.
Certainly, I can say that educational environments benefit from sort of standardization of the educator, and certainly structure. At least in what's really provided, a foundation for me to thrive as not only in my own experience educating, but also as a student as well.
One of the goals I've had for a long time has been, I wanted to create a movement of young people studying math, but people who were absolutely committed to rigor and not give an inch to those who would seek to sort of dumb things down. Because I believe students benefit most when they are given the tools to reason from first principles. And that's why I often begin with set theory, logic, because a house has to have a foundation. And mathematics, the main problem in math is that a lot of students start building, they start with a brick of the foundation, but then all of a sudden they jump, and rather than continuing to build that foundation, you start building the frame on the second floor. And then of course your house is not supported and your house will collapse. And by the time students are in algebra 1, algebra 2, They have so many gaps, and you've probably seen that. I mean, you tell people order of operations, right? And they have a vague notion of it, but then when it comes to the longer problems, they really don't have a notion of it, and that's a problem.
So, do you think that sort of unfortunate condensing of the educational timeline has caused that shift where maybe there's not enough time to, start from the first principles and build up towards it? You have seventh graders taking algebra 1. So by fifth grade they already have to be, three-quarters of the way there.
Absolutely. That is absolutely true. And it's a big problem because of our modern society. That is one of the problems I do see, because I borrow from Euclid. Euclid himself said there's no royal road to mathematics. It's not going to happen. And I think we are obsessed as a society, particularly in Western countries, because of our business model. In some ways, it has been a force for good. But in other ways, we have sacrificed rigor for speed, right? Because as a society, we're very results oriented, which means that, like you were saying earlier, right? Because that's the negative side of the transactional nature of it. Because I'm going to school, I want to learn this not because of the purity of math, but because I want to get, my piece of paper that says I'm a high school graduate or I'm a college graduate and so a lot of things are rushed. And I notice that at the college level too. If you ask my students, I never rush anything. I would rather spend the entire semester on chapter 1, set theory. If I am not satisfied that you don't know set theory, we simply won't move on. And as you've seen in your college and many other colleges, professors will move on. They say, well, we're done with set theory. So now and it's jumping, jumping, and jumping. And I think it's just terrible.
Right. So you can learn an entire subject at a shallow level over the course of one semester, jumping from start to end, with basically the Cliff Notes version of the textbook.
Yes.
Certainly the way it's happened now. What do you think? Has this been a trend of the last 15 years, the last 30 years, last century? Why has this sort of this shift from rigorous, detail-oriented education to speed and efficiency in education occurred, do you think?
I think it has to do with the fact that we have abandoned, for the most part, ever since it's a slow process, but ever since the 1960s, we've had this mentality where we need to abandon firm expectations, stern discipline, guidance. And I find if students do have firm expectations and they know that you mean business, they often exceed their own expectations. And so I've noticed that even with my videos, they bring some clarity, but also gravity to learners beyond the classroom. Those who learn, I have a lot of people who long for the sort of mathematical instruction that has regrettably gone out of style. One of the most delightful comments I had recently was, it was an older gentleman, actually. He said that my classes reminded him of what schools used to be like back in the 50s and 40s. And he said, he was pushing 90. And he said, you remind me of my math teachers in New York, who took no prisoners, but I think what has led to this is a combination of the idea that you as an adult, that it's out of style to be stern, that the trend seems to be that the more casual you are, the more friend you are, the better, right? But no, I believe that you are the professor. You are not the student's friend. You are their guide. You are there to share that knowledge with your students, to help your students for sure, to be the best that you can be for your students. But you're not their pal. You don't go out with your students, to the bar and to the club. And so there's that distinction. It doesn't make the professor better, by the way. I'm not saying that. It's not a question of superiority. It's a question of the role that you play and where you are in life. You're in chapter 1, I'm in chapter 20, and that's, but so it's a mixture of lack of discipline, lack of, the trend also is that since there are no absolute truths, right? People don't like to hear that. They don't like to hear that this is a standard. They say, well, That's your standard, but not mine. Well, that's not the way math works. It's based on a structure. So if we add to that the business model of education, which is transactional, the push for not having discipline, and the rejection of absolute moral truths, then we get the cocktail that we have today. And you see a lot of people. You tell them about absolute truths, even Christians, by the way, and I say that as a Christian, they become uncomfortable with that because they say, well, that was the Ten Commandments were written, thousands of years ago. I said, right, but I thought lying was still wrong. And so I think that there's a push to being absolutely just not formal at all in any way.
Do you think that uh, the internet has expedited that process, uh, especially in this age? There seems to be a push for or a value of authenticity.
Yes. The internet, like any tool, I believe reflects the character of the people that wield it. And so in its finest form, it offers, we have unprecedented opportunities for connection. Minds, nowadays we have minds, and the only thing that separates us is geography. But we are united in the pursuit of truth and understanding. And now we can meet virtually without ever shaking hands, right? I've seen that in my own work, students from everywhere from rural towns and even distant countries discovering the mathematics. And it becomes sort of like what I love about it is it's a logical symphony. But we all share the same passion for being right. I love it, for example, when a student from all the way as far away as Egypt writes to me and agrees on the fundamentals. But at the same time, let's not delude ourselves. The same mechanism that can build community can just as easily dilute it. And if you use it indiscriminately, the internet fosters what I call the illusion of dialogue. It's really 1,000 voices speaking, few listening, and even fewer people thinking. And there's a kind of loneliness that is born of constant stimulation. It's sort of peculiar because you are surrounded by people and yet untouched by any of them. Just like you see in major cities today, at least in the Western world, there's a growing antisocial attitude, and we see that in the behaviors of people. They're becoming increasingly worse. So I try to form a different kind of online community. My viewers, whether they're drawn to the math or to the moral clarity of the Sunday sermons, they know what they are getting. There's something solid, rooted, and structured. It's not a barrage of trends, but it's more like it's a constant message that doesn't change. And they know what to expect. And I believe people are they're hungry for that in many ways.
Right. There's a lot you touched on there that I want to get to. Uh, the it's certainly true, and this is reflected in my studies, especially that technology, just like you mentioned, it has the potential. Technology is synonymous with tool. It's a tool to be used either for good or for detriment, depending on the way the wielder implements it. The stone that was used to kill Abel might as well have been later used to build a house. Especially in cybersecurity is well, especially tools, even the emerging field of quantum computing carries just as much opportunity to be used to expand our potential and our abilities far beyond what they have been, but also carries with it the imminent threat of catastrophe if used insecurely. But building on that, it can also be used as a tool for community formation, or once again reflecting the mind of the wielder, community evisceration. So do you think, here's a question, do you think that the what has caused that sort of shift, especially highlighting the growing trend of urban loneliness, despite being surrounded by incomprehensible amounts of people? Do you think it's been that the internet has created that mindset, or instead the internet reflects the mindset of a post-COVID generation?
I think the internet is more a reflection of because at the end of the day, it's being used by us, right? It's being used by people. And I often say, right, it's like the internet can be like a fire. In the winter, it can warm the hearth or burn down the house. And in the case of the younger generation, it has done both. So on the one hand, they have more access to knowledge than any civilization in history. And on the other, as you can see, they are drowning in trivia and starving for wisdom. We have a generation that I would say that they can scroll, but maybe not necessarily reflect. And the algorithms feed them novelty, but rarely nourishment. And intellectual curiosity, that what used to be intellectual curiosity, is now being replaced by what I call intellectual grazing, which are like little bites of disconnected facts, few of which require any thought, let alone conviction. And when it comes to morality, the online world too often replaces truth with consensus. And we've confused virtue with visibility. We see that even in the math world on YouTube. For example, if you call out a person who is clearly not doing things properly, such as say scamming people, you'll get an entire army throwing arrows, poison arrows at you because they prefer the other person's smiles over the real truths and facts. So I think that the internet has simply facilitated, in many ways, what was already a growing trend. But I would not say post-COVID. I would actually say that this began as early, I would tell you, as early as the 90s, believe it or not. In a different way, the 90s had no social media. The 90s had, IRC chat rooms, which is, kind of what, that we had dial-up or whatever. But already we saw, starting in the early 2000s with the chat rooms, all the platforms, this was a growing trend. But I think that the social media is simply reflecting the values of our societies. Because even I see things on, let's say, X.com now that I heard in a different way, but similar back when I was, an undergrad in college. It's just that now, you see, a lot of people don't know this, but at Columbia University, Mark Zuckerberg, I actually had occasion to know who he was in person. And I had met him many, many years ago once because he was actually the friend of Adam Goldberg. I think they were friends, but Adam Goldberg at Columbia had created a platform. It was called CU Community. And it was very much a social media, an early social media, and already you saw nastiness on there. I mean, very much like today. The only difference was that it was limited to the campus. It was limited to the school. So I remember and it was anonymous in the beginning. So I remember one time somebody wrote, you could register as a member with your username. And I remember they had a little chat on the bottom, and people would say, "Oh, do you know Alfred, so and so? He's in my seminar, and he's the biggest, blah blah blah." You could make up whatever, but and I remember, and I knew who it was because back then people were not as tech savvy. That he actually had his name. So the next day I saw him in class, and I'd say something like, "Oh, I love the E attack," and of course, he was like, "Sorry." I said, "Oh, you don't know what I'm talking about." He said, "No." I said, "Oh, I mean your little post the other day on the," and he would just be, so I saw that happening from way before COVID.
Certainly, once again, touching on the anonymization that the internet provides, it gives people the opportunity to voice thoughts that they might not have expressed with the presentation or threat of physical confrontation, or I want to say spatial confrontation. Truthfully, the sort of backwards nature of the internet, as you highlighted, where it connects you to more people than comprehensible, all of the people, or it's something like I think there's I think there's 5 billion Facebook users, something like that, or 3 billion, something like that. It's a crazy amount. But the amount of that number might not be correct, but anyway, as far as users on the internet, there's we've networked the whole planet now. But the even though you're connected to more people and you aren't geographically limited, it's sort of a facade of communication and a facade of socialization where the most you can simulate of real social interaction is what we're doing right now, right? But even still, we aren't truly, and we can engage back and forth with one another, but we aren't truly having a social interaction. You're limited to a 1080p window of me, and that's just 20,000 RGB pixels in an audio channel, and vice versa. We're interfacing with bit representations of ourselves on other ends of the planet. So there's certainly a growing disconnect, especially as we integrate more and more expediently online and move services and interactions to online. Do you think that this trend is inevitable? Do you think that, based off of what you've seen, do you think that maybe younger generations have a value for sort of the opposite rather than the blind the blind increase of internet usage, as we've seen, the blind proliferation of internet usage? Do you think that maybe the detriments that come with it might be rejected by the emerging generations in favor of social, real physical social interaction?
I think a lot of people get into the habit, and it's a human thing, of thinking that because something currently exists, right, that it's inevitable, right? And I don't believe anything is inevitable, or I don't take anything for granted, only because history has shown over and over that things can exist, but they do not have to be used in their current form, right? So, for example, hundreds of years ago, solid wood was everywhere, and people used it. Nowadays, we still have solid wood, but we also now have synthetic wood, and we don't have to use. Although I like solid wood, I'm a solid wood guy, but I don't like the synthetic wood. But it's just another option that we have, right? So I think that if we're going to use the word inevitable, I do think that the internet, at least for now, is here to stay. Just like planes, just like cars, right? It's a reality. It's been invented. It's being used. There's no evidence to indicate that anywhere in the near future it's going to be destroyed. And even if someone tried to destroy it in some way, the tools are there to bring it back, right? So when there's a digital. I mean, you could tell me more about that because you know a lot more. But the digital glitch, right? If there's ever a hack, an attack, or whatever, it will disrupt a lot of things, but it can be with time recovered, or at least patched up. But what we have now, I think, is a kind of what I call, there's a modern obsession with constant connectivity. It's sort of a kind of digital gluttony. It's mental snacking with no mealtime, no digestion, and certainly no table manners in many cases, because we have confused access with understanding. And in the process, we've trained ourselves, I think, to consume rather than contemplate. And there's something profoundly unnatural and unsettling about being connected to a stream of noise every waking hour, because our human mind was not built for perpetual stimulation. It was built for silence, reflection, and deep thought. Pascal, the French mathematician, if I may paraphrase him, he said all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone, without Wi-Fi, I might add. So there's a constant need to over socialization, right? Like, for example, when we are interacting right now, but and later on I might upload a YouTube video on math or whatever, right? But I have a habit where it's very deliberate what I do, right? If I'm online, I still have the old school kind of, I'm going online for a purpose, whether it be to have this conversation or to to share a YouTube video on a specific topic of math. But I also know when to disconnect. And I think that now a lot of people, they're just not, it's not that they're evil or anything in that sense. It's just that they don't know any better. They don't know that you can actually be disconnected. You can actually survive without being always on the grid. And the internet sort of whispers to them, be everywhere, right? And young people today, they are seen constantly, but rarely known, not even to themselves. But I have found that wisdom, creativity, and even faith, they tend to arrive when you choose to be nowhere for a while. And that's why I treat my own online presence with the same sort of discipline that I would bring to mathematics. I don't post something to be seen. That's why I don't have an Instagram account, for example, and I don't plan on getting one at all ever. I post to say something that I think would be worth hearing in some way. And it's not about joining, the chatter, but sort of to cut through it, with clarity, structure, something more rare in the digital age, which is purpose, right? And there is virtue in solitude. And some of the best thoughts I've had, at least personally, I can't speak for everyone, but have been when I'm off the grid. And I have a library. When I'm in my library at home, I do not have any connection. I literally don't. I mean, I have books. I read books. I write books. I use a pen to write. Not that I'm saying that this is the only way, but it just helps me collect my thoughts. And I find that people now, because they're using internet so much, you have everything done for you online, and so you're not really producing anything of your own. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, sir. That does make sense. Even if you were to be typing, there's still the threat of push notifications.
Yes.
And you speak on well, there's sort of two things here. One is the effect that these sort of platforms have of constant stimulation at 15-second intervals. While stimulation, is the most preferable thing to the brain, it might not be the most healthy in that there's a balance of thoughts that are necessary for proper functioning, such as the sort of shallow stimulation that allows you to uptake new information about your environment, but also the rumination, introspection, reflection that come from longer, not antisocial, but in absence of another person. Because when you're around other people, or in a hyper-social sense, around the entire planet, in through the bits on your screen, or even if you're just in a room or a car with another person, it shifts the focus and the object of your mind from inwards intention to outwards, to this other thing. So what do you think has been the cause, or also the effects of that? As far as, is that just what the human brain and people prefer? We've moved from TV for constant stimulation to the internet in these sort of expedited information processes to the internet. Has has it been a sort of positive feedback loop of things getting faster and faster and more stimulating, or has it been that this has always been what people prefer?
I think it's a mix of both. In the case, specifically in the case of social media, people have been, um, in many cases, they don't know, they grew up on it, and so they don't know any better, right? And therefore, because they don't know any better, it's they've become so used to it that you cannot envision any other alternative. But at the same time, I think what has really, well, I'm going to talk first, if I may, of the consequence, right? What has happened with as a consequence of that. And that is that because we are, as you were saying, in this virtual sort of environment, we've lost the bonds of that used to connect. I'm talking about specifically groups of friends, right? So I was blessed in the sense that I was able to see the last, I am of the last generation, I'm Generation X, a very young Generation X, right? And depending on who you ask, some people might say I'm an Xennial, right? But I consider myself, just because of the way I grew up, solidly Generation X. Some might disagree, though. Um, with Generation X, we were the last to, because we lived, our childhood was right before digital. We still had an analog childhood. And one of the things that I believe has been completely lost is that sense of bonding that used to exist in a tight-knit group of friends. There are no secret societies anymore, right? Because we cannot have them, because internet is actually a refutation in some ways of secrecy. It is a refutation because a true secret society, right, is one where only the members know, but now everything is searchable online, right? And so eventually things leak and once that leaks, it's permanent, right? So once it's online, it's forever in many ways, right? Unless, the cache or the Google deletes it or something. Um, but your other question was about, I'm sorry, you were asking about the whether people think it's inevitable, in that sense, or if it's just like a feedback loop. Um, there are two kinds of people. I think that there has always been an element of people who want constant stimulation, right? Before they used to have it with the TV, or they would pay, they would go to instead of watching TV, they might go to a rock concert or something, right? It was more, you had to plan it more. Now I think people who don't have maybe a specific purpose, or who are bored or lonely because of the loneliness epidemic, their only way of justifying or self-entertaining themselves is through the internet, right? Because they can go online, they could look up, films that they might want to watch, music that they might want to listen to, but also participate. There's a lot of miserable people out there online as well, as you can see in the comments. You read any YouTube, even the most positive person on YouTube will get some kind of miserable person leaving some kind of hateful comment, because that's just the nature of it. So I think there are alternatives. I just think I'm skeptical of whether a lot of people are prepared to live with the alternative, because I know from my own experience, when I tell students and people around me that I don't have that I only use a smartphone for work, but that I actually switch it off anytime that I'm not working, one of their first reactions is, how are people going to find you? And I'm thinking, well, why would I want people to find me all the time, right?
It's not a natural human state.
Right. And the mind has to fine tune itself, right? You need to have a period of rest. I mean, that's just, otherwise you're overloaded. To use the cliche, you're burned out, basically. So I think it's the tragedy, it's really a tragedy, because you have so much online that is great, but you also have, it's so easy to, suffer from brain rot from all the excess of bad stuff online.
Certainly, YouTube is, as of right now, I would say the greatest tool for human education to exist. But it also carries with it, once again, a bifurcated, potential for harm or, brain rot. There's hours long lectures on YouTube, such as the ones that you provide, that you can choose to engage with, or an equivalent amount of time in YouTube Shorts. It's part of the same platform, part of the same product. depending on what your intention is when you use it. And that's an important thing. Has your intention with your off grid living, an absence of uh, computers in telecommunication devices, what has been your primary intention with that? Is it to unplug from the internet, or is it more like uh, does it carry with it more like the Amish intent?
Great question. I wouldn't say it carries the Amish intent in this, in the sense of like, I don't believe, for example, that it's necessarily, they believe, for example, that old technology of that sort is sinful, right? Whereas I believe it can be a tool that can be used for in many positive ways, many even Christ-centered ways in some ways, from if you look at it from a Christian perspective. But in my case, it's borderline romanticism of a time that I believed was and I don't want to be called nostalgic because I'm not one of the people who say that everything in the past was great. It wasn't. In fact, arguably, there are many things that are better today, I would say also. So it's not as clear cut. But in this particular framework, I do think the past was much better in the sense of that we had a high point where you had the sufficient technology to do many of the things we still do, but you could still disconnect in many ways. You might not have had YouTube, right? But you still had, you had back in those days. I remember the days of you used to be able to buy VHS courses, like tutorials on algebra. They even had algebra, and I remember watching those. You had a VCR. I go back that far, but so it wasn't as instant as YouTube. You had to actually pay for you could rent them though. But you still had to pay some money. But I regard YouTube. I agree with you. I think YouTube is the modern equivalent of the public square. It's vast, it's noisy, it's often chaotic, but if you watch the corners, there's still genuine learning where it can still occur, and it has made access to education easier in some ways. But the problem is that it has also flooded the field. You have gimmickry, theatrics, and what I call pedagogy by popularity. There are great minds out there sharing content, but they have to compete. You have entertainers masquerading as instructors. It's sort of the tragedy of the medium. It holds the Library of Alexandria, and yet the crowd, gathers around the puppet show. If that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. That's a really good analogy. Uh, yeah. So, what do you think then would the future of education look like, given the great strengths of YouTube, but also the downsides of it? And additionally, I'm curious. We have the emerging field of AI, uh, and I've heard a few of the things that you have to say about AI. But I'm very curious if AI plays a role in, yeah, in the future of education, and this in any facet that YouTube has as well.
I use, despite all the things I say, I use YouTube because I believe that if you're going to enter, and you must these days enter the agora, you may as well bring a scroll uh, and speak plainly. There will always be people, I think, who value that and will be drawn to you. They might be drawn, the majority might be drawn to the circus entertainer, that's for sure. But that's always been, right? There's always been an element of that. That's why I'm not as nostalgic as people think, because I think if you go back to, I remember school in the 80s, for example, elementary school, and if you talk to the average person about math, they would have the same reaction that people have today. Most people would either tell you that they failed it, or would say they're not interested, or they would straight up call you, a nerd or something, right? It was okay. We back then, we were actually a lot meaner in our interactions than people are today. I think people, nowadays there's a lot more an emphasis on not making people feel bad, right? So, but that said, I think with AI, yes, despite the things I say, it is a tool. It is there, already there. like, it's not going to disappear. Does it have staggering potential? Yes, but it also has the equally staggering risk. And at its best, in my view, it can make collecting and organizing information very easy in a way that can make sense. But I think it will erode the professor-student relationship. It will, because what I fear is it's going to flatten knowledge into mere data points, and it's going to tempt us to confuse automation with knowledge. Now, some people might like that, and from a business perspective, that might be legit. I'm all for freedom, right? I believe in the freedom of businesses, but I also think AI cannot replace the moral judgment of a professor or a teacher. It's never going to give you the nuance of a lived philosophy or, the delight of a well-crafted explanation. It may generate it, and it often does generate correct answers, but it cannot inspire, the kind of awe that leads a student to pursue truth for its own sake. And, I kind of see it, YouTube and AI, sort of like the chalk and slate. They are instruments. And what matters is, once again, going back to, is the hand that holds them and the mind behind that hand. So if we keep virtue, rigor, and purpose at the center of education, then yes, these tools perhaps can serve as well. But I fear, and what I think is going to happen is we're going to surrender to novelty. And we're going to risk creating students who are informed at best, but they're never actually formed. And we're already seeing that in many ways, because I've had students who tell me, you know what, professor, I can just plug in your equation into ChatGPT. Yeah, I know that. They tell me as if I didn't know. I also know that you could have done it way before ChatGPT. You could have done it on Wolfram. But the point is, right, is to demonstrate your the joy that comes from being a student is not that you can plug into the computer. Yeah, I know you can do that. I can also look something up on Google, right? That doesn't, but it takes away the mystery, the joy. Now, arguably, there are some people who will tell you, well, students have never felt joy in learning, and that is true. But I would say not every student, right? A lot of students have never found joy. You could go back to, for example, Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, early 1800s. There are reports about students rioting, throwing rocks at the windows of math professors. I mean, it's all there. But what I think is different is that sense of mystery, right? Because I don't know if you've ever felt when you actually understand something and it makes sense, you get a sense of joy. So what would be the purpose of education? If you can ask the machine anything you want, then we may as well just pack it up, because there is no joy. There's no work added. And I think as human beings, we need that. We need that confirmation that our work means something.
There's a conflicting nature of the business model, which is get the same results or greater for faster. But then from a humanitarian aspect, it's more knowledge is a sacred and joyous thing. And in education now, more than ever, I would say, analyzing some of these trends, even of the 21st century, there's been, and really this is kind of, the culture has placed a value on education for the sake of your career, which is fine and makes sense. To be efficient and do things well, you need to be educated, no matter what you do. So, to the majority of the percentages seen for a stepping stone towards business ability, but then also the nature of that is once again going back, we're condensing the timeline to get the same results. Nowadays, seventh graders take Algebra 1, which used to be restricted to the first year of high school. Mm-hmm. By the time they reach high school, have you heard of endorsements, Mr. Cromwell?
Yes.
Right. When they start high school, they basically have to pick a major. When colleges didn't even have majors at their inception. So we're shifting that timeline, earlier and earlier in development. Do you think that is for the better? Maybe we're getting the same results faster. That's better. Or do you think it's to detriment?
Think it's a detriment, but I've been saying that way before AI. I don't agree with the system of majors. I've always rejected the system of majors because if I were in charge, let's say, of the Department of Education, or not that I would want to have a federal Department of Education, but if I had to be some kind of had some power over the schools, I would get rid of majors altogether, because the way I see it is the greatest businessmen, right, in the 19th century, some of them never even went to college. And some of them, the ones who did, they went to colleges where it had what they called the curriculum that I defend, and I still uphold it at City Tutoring. It is the great books curriculum. You come, you read the classics, you have discussions on the classics. It's not so much based on the assignments per se, right? I mean, there is work, but it's more of a seminar style, right? So if I'm teaching a math course, of course there are tests, right? There are examinations. But most of the classes are actually become, at least with me, and one of the reasons students like it is because it's very relaxed. It's a discussion. It's stern, but because it's a structured discussion, but it's at the end of the day, it's you learn for the sake of the purity of the math, right? It's almost like a poetry kind of thing. And I think you can be capable of being a great businessman without necessarily having to study a specific career. Not that I'm dunking on the business major in any way. I think it can be a great thing if you have that as your purpose. But I'm saying, like, I've met people who, they major in literature and they become, great business people, not necessarily. And there's, I remember hearing something a long time ago. It was hilarious. One of my closer friends said, and it's very true. He said, in the United States, you look at STEM, what they call STEM majors, right? Math and all these, and you get nowadays, and I remember even back in when I was, more than half of the students are foreign. They are from like India, Singapore, either South Asia or Asia. And it's funny because they say, all these kids, they work so hard, right? And they come from a culture where this is so emphasized. Their parents emphasize. I have some like that at City Tutoring, and their parents are they escaped poverty. So for them, education has to have that technical purpose. But then there's that joke that says, the Rashid from, Egypt or whatever, ends up working in IT, but the owner of the company was the jock who had a C average in school, right? Was the American jock, so to speak, right? So because I think in order to be a successful business, it takes more than just knowing a technical thing. You have to have the people skills. You have to have the social skills, the relationships, and the daring attitude. And that's something that I noticed that I try to foster in my students. I would rather. That's why I said, it sounds extreme, but I'd rather be around with men who've done time rather than someone who has always been sheltering themselves from any kind of adversity. Because the greatest minds we've had in history, at least in American history, have been men who took that daring step and who might not have had. Look at Abraham Lincoln, for example. He was educated on Shakespeare and the Bible. He didn't have a major. And back then, colleges were basically a finishing school for gentlemen. I'm not saying it should only be for gentlemen of a certain name, right? That's not what I'm arguing for. But I do think there is something to be said for college being a finishing school of sorts to sort of become well-rounded, but without stressing out so much about a specific career path, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Do you find that with the nature of the economy now is much more specialized than it was back then? Even the trend is to get more and more and more specialized. Do you find that it's necessary to use that time to become educated in a specialization? Maybe we have another sort of finishing school, or what do you think the solution might look like? At a sketch level, to ensure the well-roundedness, but also ensure that we meet the standard in criteria for specialization in today's economy?
That's a great question. But I think it can be solved very easily through you can still be well-rounded, but then if you need that technical skill, right? We've had for a long time vocations, right? Vocational schools, technical schools, training schools, and you could do that, simultaneously, right? Or you could do it, partially, one or the other, right? They can complement each other. And I think you're going to see we're moving towards a lot of business leaders today are actually of my generation. They're actually Generation X, and very there's been a trend to move away actually from, yes, there is specialization, but a lot of companies would rather train you themselves. See, because if I had a company, right, like let's say that required a very technical, like what you do, for example, very high tech skill. In some way, I would rather train you myself because I would want some kind of loyalty from that. And I know that if I trained you in a specific way, you would have that skill would be applicable exclusively to me. There's a selfish component to that, but it's also a way that gives you an opportunity because we used to have back in the day apprenticeships. Right, that was the early version of the sort of the intern, and a lot of companies now, even the specialized companies, even the tech companies, they are moving away um, from certain expectations, right? And they would rather have someone who is more entrepreneurially minded, more open, more aggressive in a positive sense in their spirit.
That's a really good point and highlights some actual physical, observable trends of the job market. Do you think that another role that universities have played throughout history, maybe their longer standing role has been it was universities and churches that were the gatekeeper of information, of knowledge. They were the institutions that held these things, and churches only pertain to or largely pertain to more religious studies. But as far as secular material studies, universities were the arbiter of this information. Do you think that in the age of information, where universities, at least their leg up on the competition, has been eroded by the internet, the playing field has been leveled by the internet? Do you think that that has played a role in the sort of downplayment of the specialized college major education to now where a lot of companies would prefer, like you were saying, to hire you and train you, whether maybe you attain a certification while working with them. And a large portion of that education comes from not only on-the-job experience, but also online courses, which are much more economic than institutions. Do you think that that the internet has played a role there in that trend of breaking down the educational barrier to career?
In some ways, yes, but not exclusively. I think what has happened is that what the internet has done is made something that was very evident to some of us who noticed it, but others were too afraid to discuss it. And it was that universities have become increasingly political institutions. And I mean, there was always a political component. It's inevitable, right? Just like many churches can be political as well. So there's always that. But what had happened in recent decades was not just that the universities were becoming politicized excessively, but that they were also degrading their standards in the name of some political objective. And there is ample evidence of that, where we have students graduating from colleges who cannot even write properly. And then it begs the question, why are you charging students? Why students are graduating with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt? And I've seen it myself. And again, this is not dunking on students. I'm not blaming the students. I am blaming a system that has enabled this. And the student comes to you, and I've interviewed people, very young people, and they cannot write an essay. And I'm thinking, so what happened here? there's that disconnect, and we're seeing it. And a lot of companies are realizing, look at all these graduates and they can't even do, basic stuff. So why we may as well train them ourselves, because a company is going to ultimately hire, and this from business, a company hires you because they're going, and not that there's anything wrong with this, they make money off of that,
Right.
right? Nobody's going to hire you if they're going to lose money. And so I think what has happened is, the companies always want the best that they can get at the most reasonable level that they can get in terms of paying, right? Nobody's going to pay you in excess of what you are actually worth on the market, unless there's some kind of government intervention or whatever. But that's a whole nother thing. So I don't think the internet is not that the internet has degraded the quality or the expectations of universities. I think universities did that to themselves. And what the internet did was to show exactly what was happening, and people are looking for alternatives. Because why would I want to pay if I'm going to be in a school where a lot of my class, not a lot, maybe, hopefully not, but where several of my classmates are not even qualified to be there, but they were, admitted on the basis of their some kind of trendy group thing that is in vogue now. Why would I do that when I can get a better education without the drama online?
Right, exactly. And most of the time, well, thanks to YouTube, for free versus like $100,000.
Right.
Especially, even Harvard lectures, which may or may not be the best, according to price and tradition, supposedly they're the best. Even those are posted online.
Yeah, the notes, even the notes.
Yes, exactly. And as you were speaking on earlier, even these courses from a university with a price tag, you might not be getting any more engagement than you would from a YouTube course with an absent professor through an online course that, once again, uploads PowerPoints. And that is the extent of the source material.
I recently had, there was a discussion. A professor said, "Oh, you might have seen, I don't know, on my YouTube channel, I mentioned there was an article in the Atlantic, and they said, oh, the students don't know how to read." And I'm thinking, right, but what are you doing as a professor to fix that? What are you doing to your students? You can complain all you want, right? You can say, oh, there was some kind of once upon a time, all my students read. But the fact is, if you are not fostering, what's going on in that classroom where your students are not reading? And you might say, a professor might say, well, that's their responsibility. Yes and no. It is their responsibility to read, but it's also your responsibility to have certain expectations and demand and comply and execute those expectations. I can guarantee you, I make my students read. And my students, some of them will complain for sure. They'll say, no, I don't want to read. I've had students out, I'm not going to read 500. I say, oh, you're going to read the 500 pages. Because if you don't read them, there will be a consequence. And the consequence is a failing grade. And when a student sees that, and I don't know if you would agree with me as a student, but I think it makes sense, right? If you had a professor who told you, you're going to fail my class, you're paying for the course, right? And if I told you, if you don't read the books that I'm assigning on this syllabus, I'm going to fail you. You're going to earn an F. I would think that would be a motivating factor for you to read.
Certainly. I can say that from my own experience. Additionally, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask or touch on this. I did watch that video of yours, but additionally, I read that article in the Atlantic, like, I don't know, 8 months ago or so when it came out, about how, just as a background, at Brown University, it was an article where students were, it was basically the point of view of professors, where students were coming into a freshman level reading course, like a classics course, and were telling professors that they were unable to finish a book, and that up to this point in their education, upon admittance to an Ivy League college, had never read a book cover to cover, and instead, due to standardized testing curriculums, had been trained to read excerpts of stories and articles and videos. And But I found your uh, perspective and take on this article was very refreshing and unique and unintuitive as far as what me and everyone I shared that article with, what their reading of it was, instead of a sort of vacant blame on an entire school system, from K through 12 to university level, had been, eroded, and at this point there was sort of nothing you could do about it, which is now sort of the status quo of, well, that's the way the system is. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do. It's over, and maybe that's part of the state of the human condition. But additionally, I found that your take as a peer of these speakers, addressing this problem, placing personal responsibility rather than the responsibility to hold students to this standard, rather than lowering your standards in pursuit of mediocrity.
The cop out. Because I can tell you, I've had students from very, very tough backgrounds. Those are the students I enjoy the most, by the way. That when I've had very tough demographics, students who had not. I've had students who dropped out of school. I've had students who were in jail, and those are the best ones, by the way. Why? Because that when they actually come to you, they have this spirit of resilience in them. And when they see that you have the expectation, they know that you have the standards. And I just don't accept this whole, oh, that's just the way it is. I don't accept it because I see it in my own students that when I have standards for them, even students who have no math background at all, we start from scratch and they actually end up doing the work. And they actually end up, and somebody criticized me one time. They said, oh, that's because you terrify your students. I said, that's a good thing. Because if they know that there are going to be consequences, right? They know that I'm going to execute the consequences. But that has created such a positive environment. I've never had, and I don't say this to brag. It's just a fact. I was surprised myself. I've never had a negative student evaluation, not one. And I've been teaching for, if I count my days of tutoring, I have piles and piles of evaluations that I could show you, more than 20 years. Not one student has ever, the most that I've gotten, and it's not a personal thing. It was more that the student wrote that the class was useless to them, that they thought, I do get that from time to time because one of the questions on the evaluations is, how is this course relevant to your job, to your professional, and I tell them, tell the truth. Tell them that it's not relevant, right? We want the truth. I'm not offended by that. But I have never had a personal student say anything negative towards me. So maybe I terrify, I don't know, but these are anonymous. So I don't think it's a question of me terrifying them. I think it's a question of that they know what to expect from me. That's all it is.
Right. There's an element that maybe you carry. I'm curious as to what this is. It might make you a more efficient and more effective educator. But what is the role, or maybe you don't have this, what is the role that A, caring, and B, empathy play in your operation?
I see them as very connected, right? Caring and empathy, they do go hand in hand. But I think with empathy, right, there's this trend now where you see empathy is often interpreted as enabling, right? Enabling bad habits. And whereas for me, empathy is being suffering someone, being patient with someone, but not enabling, in other words, not justifying bad behavior, right? So I think we can be compassionate. I've had students, for example, they're single mothers, right? And they say, you know what, I couldn't do the assignment on time. But the fact that they called me and the fact that they are communicating with me, that's already, I mean, in this society, that's already a plus. The fact that they actually call me on the telephone and tell me what their problems are. So when it comes to being compassionate, I think you always have to know who. That's why I believe in knowing who your students are. And what I mean by knowing, I even try to do that on YouTube. Every time I can, I ask people who leave comments, if I try to answer everyone. Nowadays, it's becoming harder because now I'm getting thousands of them. But if I do answer someone, I always try to find out a little bit about them, like what state are you in? What do you study? Are you in college? Are you in high school? Because I think that creating a profile in your mind helps you see who you are dealing with, and it helps tailor your response and your lesson to that person. If that makes sense?
Perfect sense. Certainly, the modern state of caring hasn't been sort of morphed this way, but empathy has sort of been seen as a softer hand when dealing with things. But I understand you have once again a more traditional and sterner or more rigorous take on this, which might be for the better, which is seeking to understand, but not seeking to enable.
We live in a culture that prizes nowadays speed, right? But so if you teach with care and you teach for the sake of teaching, for the sake of the beauty of it, it's really a quiet rebellion. And I intend to keep rebelling. After all, I've always said, as a child of the great Protestant Reformation, we are iconoclasts par excellence. That's what we do. And a lot of what made our country great historically has been exactly that same spirit of fiercely independent, or as the British would say, they would say, you're all, bloody minded. And sometimes you have to be. And, I still see that in America, outside the big cities, because the big cities have become, and I say that in a bad way, Europeanized in many ways. But you go to what I call the real America, and I know some people disagree with my term here, but when I say the real America, I'm talking about rural America, deep into the country. And you still see that. You still see that spirit of, doing things differently, doing things your own way. A rejection of this whole, oh, that's the system, so we just have to accept things. I see that spirit around here in many ways. People here are, in general, are very independent minded. They're skeptical of the school system. They are skeptical of a lot of the things going on in our colleges today.
Did you find that your passion and care when creating your own business were those necessary qualities? Would you have been able to start your own organization without the passion and without the care that you carry?
Because I think what has always driven, at least ever since I can remember making decisions that were important in my life, it's always been because I liked something, because I had a passion for something, not because I had to do it necessarily. So, for example, when I did my degree at Columbia, many people were saying they wanted to know the purpose behind it, right? Like, oh, are you going to become a financial analyst, or no? So then why are you studying math? Oh, because I like it. They couldn't, and they would say, but wait a minute, you're spending all this money just because you like it. You could do that anywhere. I said, well, in my case, it was also strategic because I did not, my Colombian education was very cheap, actually. I paid almost nothing for it because I had scholarships. And so I was able to, at the high school level, I never wanted to get into excessive debt, because debt is something that I mean, there are some debts that can make you, that are smart, right? Like, even if you have the cash, I would never say to somebody to buy a house cash. Why? Because, you still want to have that long term, with inflation and everything, right? You want to have that long term mortgage in case things go south. But when it comes to what I've done, it's always been because I think the key to success is doing things because you have a passion in what you do. You like what you do. And even if it makes you poor, I could have been making, when I graduated, at the time, if I wouldn't have done what I did, I could have ended up on Wall Street and be making like millions of dollars a year. Like many people do, that a lot of my classmates are like that. But then I look at their lives now, and they are not really fulfilled people. I'm saying, and I know this for a fact. They may be married, they have their formulaic life, but they are very miserable people, some of them, and so that's not something that I wanted for myself.
I completely understand. To those who are dispassionate, when you say that you're doing something because you like to do that thing, it seems incomprehensible. Uh, Now that was sort of before the long before the internet has reached the state that it is today. I was going to ask, and I think you're in a perfect position to aptly answer this. Uh, with the internet today, as we've touched on, being an enabler of the state of constant stimulation and therefore of constant boredom, really, transient entertainment. Uh, do you think that has led to an increase of dispassionate or dispassion, uh, and made it more difficult for the younger generations to find things that they're passionate about, or has it always been that way?
I think it's always been that way, actually, because I remember back in my day, a lot of people were still very formulaic, and they were not as passionate about certain things. They might have been involved, they might have joined a club, or they might have, which still happens today. They might have gone to some protest. That still happens today. But I think that when I think of passion, I mean like truly making sacrifices in your own life that might not get you material gain necessarily. Not that that's always bad, by the way. There's something to be said about proper financial planning, right? Rather than just being poor and expecting society to somehow pay for it and bail you out. But I'm talking about, sacrificing, making do with a little bit less, but at the same time having the satisfaction that comes from creating a path towards something that you believe is righteous. And that has been the key in many of the things so I've delayed a lot of things that people would have already done, 15, 20 years ago, once they finished school. But I think I've had a very great, fulfilling life so far because I've seen so much, and I've been in positions where, I've been on both ends of the spectrum, right? I've traveled a lot. I've seen how people interact, and but I don't think that people necessarily have less passion now. I think there were always people who try to bring you down. There were always people who tried to discourage you, because I was discouraged many times. In fact, even applying to Columbia University was discouraged, because the reason being that at the time, very few people in my small town would have done that. That was huge. And the counselor, I remember, said, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" And she said, you've never really left the suburbs. It's a big city or whatever. I said, "That's exactly what I want." And I knew that I wanted, and I prayed about it. And that's what I felt, the calling of God. And I ended up doing very well at Columbia. I loved despite the politics of Columbia, it's always been like that. I've always, it was fun. The difference I would tell you, though, is that back then students actually were more willing to have a discussion with you despite disagreements. Whereas I think now it has become a situation where if you disagree with a certain view, you are akin to a criminal to some people. You are no longer, see, I grew up in a time where you could have told me, if you told me you were a socialist, I would have debated you. I would have disagreed firmly with you. I would have tried to defeat you politically, but I would not have seen you as a criminal. I would not have completely destroyed your dignity as a human being, right? Whereas I think now we're both people are doing it. It doesn't matter conservative or not. It's not about that. It's more that because of the online communities, I think that has changed. We have echo chambers now. And we have become people who, if we hear someone who is, let's say, I see it on the conservative side, you say he's a leftist and he's a horrible, disgusting human. And then the left, right? They do that too. If you happen to disagree with, like me, I disagree with DEI. I've been called a Nazi. I've been called a racist. I've been called, and even worse names, because we're no longer having these debates, right? No one wants to have a debate. It's easier to stick on a label, and it's easier that's a cop out of the discussion. That's how I see it.
Do you find that openness has played a role in that sort of exchange? Shifting from openness to ideas and perspectives and new insight. Do you find that's played a role and has shifted culturally, from maybe back then to these days?
In some ways, because I think that as bonds, the traditional bonds that held us together have been broken. It used to be first, you had family and you had an identity from that family, right? Then you had religion. That was another tie. Uh, then you had your groups of friends, right? And I think that now, because we are so disconnected, because we move around all the time, we've had to create these sort of like online virtual, but in a way it's fake because it's not really tied to you in any way. But because it's saying the things that you like to hear, you think it's your community, but it's really not. You have no community. And you have a lot of these people, I used to say to them, outside of true bonds, you have no future. And that's what I think we've sacrificed with the new society, because people move around America. That's something I learned in Europe. The Europeans actually called me out on that. And they're right. They would say, what I notice about Americans all the time, Americans are not grounded to the place that they were born. In other words, and I was an example of that. They said, like you meet people in France, and very rarely would you hear somebody in a village in France moving off to Paris just because, right? That's not. And then now it's changing a little bit more, but they would say, look, I meet Americans, and you say like they'll say, I'm from Houston, but I've only lived in Houston for 2 years. My family lives in Arizona, and then I have, my uncle lives in Seattle. It's just all spread out. And they don't have that. They're way closer to each other. And I think that that's a huge plus in their societies that we don't have here.
Certainly, when the community formation and the formation of identity, which you derive from your community, isn't geographical, is not necessarily religious, checking these boxes, is not based off of family or physical friendship. Instead, the replacement there has been online communities. And there's an excellent model. I brought this up in the last interview. I'm going to bring it up again, and I'll probably still misquote it or misattribute it. But I think it was Osen. And they created a model basically simulating the formation of echo chambers. That is, homogeneous groups of like-minded individuals in communities online. So what they did to simulate this was they took a heterogeneous group of all different sorts of simulated demographics, and they represented these demographics with dots. So you'd have like a red dot belonging to X demographic, age, gender, geographical location. So you'd have a red dot here, a blue dot, and all of these different colors. And when they allowed for time to pass, where based off of the simulated preferences of these dots were for X or Y thing based off of their demographic. And they were plugged into a model that fed them more and more content of what they want to see. Those are modern day algorithms. That's how they function. They found that these dots belonging to all of these demographics sorted themselves over time, and very quickly too, basically showing based off of filtering for preference, preferred content, these people sorted themselves into their own echo chambers, because humans don't necessarily have a desire for that other perspective that comes with openness. So given the natural occurrence of that, how do you think we can balance given the detriments that come with identity formation based around echo chambers and homogeny of thought? How do you think we can balance the giving people what they want to see, which is good, I suppose, versus preventing the formation of echo chambers?
I think we have to go back to developing or fostering we used to have that, a debate culture. And what I mean by debate culture is like the schools used to promote things like civics, and not shielding people, because nowadays with the legislation in the schools, a lot of students are shielded from under the guise of, they have trigger warnings now, right? And that has shielded people from hearing things that they may not necessarily be right, but that they should hear because people are saying them and they are a reality. So I think there has been a push. We are living in an age of lies, where people have always lied, but lies are elevated to virtues now. And what I mean by that is fantasy, right? Somebody's fantasy about what they are or what they should hear or should be is often promoted at the expense of truth or at the expense of hearing other truthful perspectives. So, for example, many schools, you've seen it in the colleges, if there's a speaker who goes to visit and the people don't like, the student groups don't like who the speaker is, they literally shut down the speaker. Now, you could always heckle, right? That's always been part of, I'm not one of those people, like I said, it's not about being nostalgic. There's always been heckling of speakers people don't like. That's not new. And you could go back to the 1800s. I mean, Lincoln was heckled several times. Pastors were heckled. People used to throw, all kinds of stuff at preachers. The point being, though, that there was still a culture of debate. There was still a culture where you had to be confronted with like you would write an essay and you had to write the essay as the opposing viewpoint, whether you agree with it or not. Attorneys still do that, but they're the only ones who still do that. Everyone else, we've lost that. And so I think that if we trained people to actually have open discussion, debate discussion, yes, including things that might be hurtful to your feelings, it might be. But it goes both ways, you see. Nowadays, people only want to protect one side. I could just as easily say that there are things that hurt my feelings. Right. But I know that they're there. That's why I don't read, some of the comments on YouTube that they leave on my channel. I cannot no human being wants to read things that are meant to be hurtful because that's, it's stressful. And people say, oh, it doesn't bother me. Of course, they're lying. Every human being is bothered when someone says something about you that may not be true or that can be hurtful, whether it be about your opinion, whether it be about your physical appearance, that's always there. So I try to focus on the things that I know I can say and not waste so much time on the particulars.
That's very good. Especially, the brain doesn't have a sort of filter as far as how it decides to qualify what's input into it. So even if you attempt to discredit negative comments, they don't exist in a compartmentalized area of your brain, and they do affect you, as does every form of input.
I've had that happen to me occasionally. Back when I started teaching, the days before memes, people used to draw sketches of you that could be, but caricatures, and that's different because that doesn't really bother me because it's supposed to be like a drawing of someone's depiction of you is how they see you, right? And I always used to say, at one time they drew me with with a nose that I thought was much bigger than what I know I have a bigger nose, but they used to call it the Napoleonic nose, but not quite as big as they would, and I thought that those were entertaining. They once drew me as some kind of like Puritan with the pitchfork. Those are funny. But when you start reading, comments like that often people leave, you effing this and this and that. And, I often just, I try not to read them because we could not, no human being could actually not be stressed without reading so many of the negative stuff.
Certainly. Well, Mr. Cromwell, this has been an excellent interview.
Thank you.
Your path, as far as what your passion has led you down, has been certainly off the beaten path and very different. I've got one more question to ask you. Calling back to, you cite having a more fulfilling life despite not following the necessary formula post-college. in what ways, if you found it at all, in what ways have you found meaning in your life? I think, has it been something that you've had to create? I think that given your pursuit of this alternative pathway due to your convictions has set you up to be someone that's more in tune with what, or has a more defined perspective on what meaning is, because you've had to personally confront it. In what ways have you found or created meaning, or is it something that you're still searching for?
I don't think I'm in the business of, if I may use the verb, creating meaning, right? I don't really chase it like some people chase it sort of like a novelty on a shelf, right? Uh, I believe meaning is not always created, but it can be. But I believe firmly that it can be discovered for the most part, because since meaning precedes us and our task is to uncover it with reverence, right? Sort of like I always see it like archaeologists brushing dust from something eternal, right? And that's how I see myself when it comes to math. I merely excavate what has long been buried, and I try to bring it back to life because I believe that by resurrecting those past truths and standards, the present bad habits can change. They have to change inevitably. It's almost like imagine if how different, right? I always compare this. Imagine how different our country would be if would be today. In many ways, if we suddenly had the ability to bring back life to life on earth, the millions of great patriots of the past who unfortunately are no longer with us. Imagine our country once again repopulated by those great men and women of the past. However, I think there is hope because while we cannot obviously bring those great people back or those great mathematicians, patriots, scholars, we can bring back their ideas. And that I think is something worth fighting for. I think that if you and me and others hold fast to these truths, we can truly spark a transformation in the attitudes we see. I have the occasion to see that firsthand around me. People know, for example, that in my classes, we take things very seriously, right? In a good way. We suffer no fools, so to speak. And for me, meaning is found in fidelity, right? To truth, to discipline, to tradition, to God. And they're not fashionable pursuits. They're steady ones. I find meaning in the act of teaching, not because it flatters the ego, but because I think teaching transmits something greater than the self, actually. I find meaning in structure, in ritual, in the small, quiet victories of a mind that is more resilient and sharper because of math. Now, you asked me, have I found meaning? Um, but yes, but not. I don't see it as something like once, right? It's not something like finding a coin in a field. I find it daily uh, when you choose to live deliberately, to speak truthfully, to uphold your standard of beauty and goodness. We're living in a world that often discards both, as we said earlier. So if I'm still searching, it's not because I'm lost, but because the depths of meaning are endless. And like a great math idea, the more I understand, the more I realize how much remains to be seen. So I believe in walking forward, right? Not in a restless way, but also in a faithful way.
It's a very poignant answer. Uh, well, thank you very much. It's been that answer alone, but everything, up to this point in this interview, it's been excellent insight into educational philosophies. The depth of your experience has afforded you to sort of see past what might be more contingent trends, into understanding the illusion of either this is the way this always has been, or it's like this now and it used to be better. The clarity with which you see through these sort of illusions has afforded a lot of very valuable insight. I'm sure not only to me, but also to my peers.
To hear that. Thank you.
So thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today on all of these topics. Do you have anything else? Any closing messages or anything?
I mean, what I hope to inspire in people, if I may promote it, if they are interested in mathematics and mathematics from a rigorous perspective, meaning a pure mathematical perspective, if you really want to understand why something works in the way it does in math, I recommend that they go to the channel City Tutoring Math, and they'll see. I do have Sunday messages as well. I am not a preacher. I'm not a licensed preacher or anything like that. I just share what I do on Sundays is I'll read a passage from the scripture, something that I read that morning, and then I'll sort of sit down and kind of go through it with my audience. Some people like it, some people don't, but as I said, I do what I like, not what I'm not there to please crowds. I'm there to share a perspective of truth.
Gotcha. Anyway, let's wrap this up. Thank you one more time. It's been excellent.
Thank you.